the gun debate in Ukraine has obviously amped up quite a bit over the last several years. And now it appears there's even an active effort, perhaps seems like it's going fairly well too, to actually enshrine gun rights protections in the nation's laws. You profiled this activist or this politician who's going down this road. Can you give us just some of the basic starting line of what this story was about and who this person is?
Yeah, so we profiled this man, Marian Zablotsky. He's a member of Zelensky's party, the Servant of the People Party. He's a member of parliament here in Ukraine, and he has deep ties with the conservative movement in the United States. He's one of the authors of a bill that would essentially provide a right to firearms for all civilian Ukrainians, creating a universal right. It's not quite as strong. It's not a constitutional amendment, so it wouldn't be quite this, it wouldn't be like the Second Amendment in the United States, but it would be the first law of its kind that would guarantee a general right to firearms for civilians. So he's been doing a lot of work on this. I can get into both kind of his desire to arm as many civilians as possible, as well as his kind of legislative priorities and what he's trying to do in Parliament. And we can expand on that a little bit, especially since, there's a unique aspect of all of this, right? And, usually when we're talking about gun rights, we're not talking about a country that's in the middle of an active conflict or a war zone. Ukraine is in the middle of an active war where a lot of people have been changing their minds about, the appropriate regulations around guns, given that there have been a lot of atrocities and war crimes committed by Russia in this country. People like Marian Zablotsky, they believe that tyrants really only understand the language of violence, and the only way to respond to authoritarianism is to arm the broader public.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the things that strikes me about reading the piece are some of the quotes that he gave you guys, because they're very, very similar to what you hear in the United States from gun rights activists. Here, just for as an example, he said, quote, "If we had the same gun ownership percentage as the United States does, Russia would never have dared to invade us." That's a super common point of view. He also in the United States about just civilian gun ownership, civilians being armed. He also said, quote, "There are more guns in the U.S. than necessary for the population's safety. Therefore, I thought some Americans might be willing to share excess firearms and donate them to Ukrainians in need." So he's also like pointing to this program, and we'll get a little bit deeper into this later because it's fascinating to me. It sounds a lot like what we did during World War II with the British. There were private drives in addition to what the government was sending over in land lease. There were private drives to collect firearms and send them to the British public as well. And it sounds like that's also happening here with Ukraine, but which is one fascinating aspect of this. But this dude, he sounds a lot like, he might be a spokesperson for the NRA, and that's not a common thing to come across in Europe, right?
Well, this is someone who has, pretty extensive ties with, Republicans of the right in the United States. And, he mentioned to me that he had been to Grover Norquist's weekly meeting in Washington, D.C., which is a regular meeting of conservative activists.
The Wednesday
that
meeting.
Get together. The Wednesday meeting. And what they do is they get together and they talk about how to advance the conservative cause through their various activism and different organizations. So he's connected with that group, and what he was able to do with his connections with on the right in the United States is to organize the transfer of firearms donated by American gun activists, as well as he managed to create a process whereby the Miami Police Department was able to do a gun buyback and then ship any firearms that they gathered to Ukraine, which is where they ended up with police and other kind of territorial defense units.
Yeah, that's pretty fascinating too. That's kind of another maybe scrambling of what you might think of as normal politics, because gun buybacks, people who operate gun buybacks are usually not wanting to give those guns to anyone else. They want to have them destroyed or what have you. But in this case, he's managed to create this program where they get sent to Ukrainians to use in this defensive war against the invading Russians. So he's kind of cobbled together a very interesting supporting cast here for this effort. And it sounds like they've gotten pretty far. These guns are actually reaching the territorial defense groups. Now, that can you explain how those work? What the is that like the National Guard we would think of here in the United States, or obviously Ukraine being in a hot war right now, things are a little different.
Yeah, I think that's the best. Yeah, I think that's the best analogy. Yeah, so they're the kind of like local territorial militias, I guess. They're regionally based, so they don't get sent from their particular region to the front. They're responsible for their particular zone, and so the territorial defense units, yeah, closer to the Russian border of Ukraine, they're obviously in greater need of military aid and equipment than territorial defense units further away. Now, the territorial defense unit that Zablotsky, in this case, managed to get weapons to, it's a unique territorial defense region. It's called the Irpin region. Now, you may remember when the full-scale invasion started in 2022, Irpin, which is near Bucha, which is near Ostomel, these are Kyiv area regions that were absolutely devastated in the initial weeks of the invasion, as the Russians were shelling central Kyiv. And ultimately, when the Russians withdrew from these areas, a lot of atrocities were uncovered. People who were executed summarily or tortured, interrogated, beaten, all sorts of war crimes became evident after Russia withdrew from that region. And so they have these memories and this history that relates to civilians feeling like they didn't have the weaponry necessary to protect themselves.